Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. We are very excited to have you here. We know it's summer, it's warm outside, and you can be doing a lot of other things. So thank you for joining us. We hope this is a fun conversation for you, and we hope you get a lot out of it. We are very lucky today to have a very special co-host. But before I introduce our co-host, I want to let you know that Dr. Holly Mackey is also here, and she is going to pop in later and provide her perspective on today's topic. So Dr. Brian Van Groningen, who agreed without hesitation to be our co-host today, I like to call a homegrown, UCEA a member, basically. He was here at headquarters for 4 years while at UVA, and we're super happy to have him back. He is definitely a friend of not only UCA, but Jackson Scholars Network as well. And Dr. Van Groningen is an assistant professor now at the University of Delaware. And aside from that, he is a scholar, a mentor, a son, a brother, a friend, and he is today your co-host. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Van Groningen, for being here.
Well,
and
Danny,
if you're ready, take it away.
Sure. Well, Danny, thanks for those kind words. It's good to be asked and to contribute and give back to UCEA, but in particular the Jackson Scholars Network. So I'm happy to be here. So I think for today, with the topic of productivity and sheltering in place, there's a range of discussion topics that are on deck. And so what I thought to do first was just introduce a little bit about me and my research agenda, and then talk about 4 ideas for studies that I think are appropriate and potentially well aligned for this idea of sheltering in place and having to continue the march of scholarship and productivity despite schools and districts having to shift considerably how they go about doing school. So I'll start first with just a brief background about myself. I'm a first-generation college graduate, first person in my family to graduate with a bachelor's degree, and then a master's, and then a doctorate. And so this idea of higher education is particularly important to me. And after I finished my bachelor's and my master's, I was a teacher, a department chair, and a school leadership team member. And while I was at my last institution before I enrolled in my doctoral program, I was part of an initiative that launched a significant redesign of the curriculum instruction and assessment that we did in our social studies department. And we had mixed reviews. We had some administrators who were on board. We had some others who were not on board. We had some parents who were not on board, but then others who were, some students that really loved what we were doing, and then students that didn't like what we were doing. And so these reviews from all kinds of constituents were mixed. And ultimately, the institution decided to go a different direction. And I started to become really interested in the influence of leadership on change management in organizations. Because when I was at my last institution for 4 years, I had 3 different principals, and each of them had mixed feelings about the redesign that we were doing in the department that I was chair of. And so these questions started to come up about what is the influence of leadership on organizations? What's the influence of organizational routines on staff members, organizational culture? And that led me to apply for doctoral programs. And then I applied for the program at the University of Virginia, specializing in educational leadership and policy. And that's where I spent 4 years finishing my doctorate. And so while my heart will always remain in curriculum and instruction and assessment, specifically in social studies education, I chose to focus on leadership just because of the fact that you're at a little bit of a higher level in terms of levers that you can pull to make some changes throughout the building in terms of culture. And so one thing that I wanted to highlight about my time as a doctoral student at UVA is that I had a range of mentors that had very diverse and different approaches I use the phrases do research and do teaching. And so they ranged from a structural functionalist who specialized in foregrounded organizational structures and routines, all the way to critical feminists who foregrounded power and culture. And so I had exposure to a range of different paradigms and approaches, and I think that served me well when it comes to brainstorming research questions and then talking with colleagues about what kinds of studies that you could do, and then how that influences the kinds of courses that you propose, and then the courses that you might be fortunate enough to teach. And so that led me to where I am now. I just finished my first year as an assistant professor, specializing in educational leadership at the University of Delaware, and my primary appointment is in our EDD program. And Delaware is a small state. We have 3 counties, but we have practitioners who are from preschools all the way up to institutions of higher education in the New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware area. And it's really an honor and a privilege to teach in this program because these folks are active practitioners, as I mentioned, and they have jurisdiction over considerable constituents. And so whether it's students in a classroom, for instance, or if they're at the school district level. And so we get the chance to really work on evidence-informed decision-making skills and root cause analyses with them so they can become better problem solvers and better problem identifiers. And so I wanted to highlight just that brief background before I jump into where we're going to go next. And so my scholarship and teaching interest, I'd say my scholarship on the whole specializes in organizational resilience. And that's a term from outside of education, but with just looking at the words, trying to build more resilient organizations. And so this includes different kinds of disciplines for human resource development, environmental scanning, organizational learning, change management, and I think a number of these notions also tie to policy. So there's a policy component to it as well. And so I do work in 2 broad areas, leadership for school improvement and the preparation of educational leaders. And within leadership for school improvement, there are 3 groups of actors that I tend to work with and study. So one would be school level leadership teams, so principals, assistant principals, department chairs at the high school level, grade level team leaders at elementary school levels, state education agencies, so those departments in state bureaucratic governments and structures who are responsible for quote unquote school at the state level, and then the governance aspect of education at the state level through state boards of education. And as Danny mentioned in the introduction, I was also a graduate assistant for UCEA when I was at the University of Virginia, and that sparked an interest in the preparation of educational leaders. So I had a chance to work with some of the leading scholars that examine and study that aspect of our field in terms of preparation. And so that's become an interest of mine, specifically the kinds of learning experiences that educational leadership preparation programs create so that they can have more of an influence on the mindset and the practices of their leadership candidates when they're in the program, and then once they finish the program and return to their context of practice. And so how that informs my teaching as well is at the University of Delaware, I teach courses in 3 areas. One is in evidence-informed decision-making. The second is in qualitative and mixed data collection and analysis. I consider myself to be somewhat of a generalist methodologically, but have chosen to dig deeper into the literature and the training on qualitative and mixed methods, and then have some very wonderful collaborators who have very deep and rich quantitative perspectives and skills that we love to collaborate on for some projects. And then a third area is teaching in leadership theory and practice, and a good block of that course centers on getting to know yourself better as a person and as a leader. And so I think my scholarship informs my teaching, and then my teaching certainly has informed my scholarship given the practitioners that I get the chance to work with. And so I use that, that brief story at the beginning to set up, the purpose of today's webinar, which is the notion of sheltering in place, but also this notion of being productive. And so the word productivity within the context of academia typically would be, centered around the notions of scholarship, teaching, and service. And I think we have a diverse set of topics for today. And given that diversity, I'll tend to focus mostly on scholarship right now in terms of research or production. And so the COVID-19 pandemic, has introduced some interesting circumstances that doctoral students and especially researchers are having to contend with. So where we'll go next is the idea that the pandemic has thrown into question a lot of scholarship efforts. My colleagues at the University of Delaware, collaborators, other institutions, and this has especially hit scholars who conduct in-person research in schools. And so schools and districts are contending, right now as we speak about how they're going to do school. And so if you turn to that for doctoral students are contending with progress and degree completion. So, the fact that you can still make progress toward the degree in terms of online instruction, in terms of conducting research efforts via distance mechanisms or media. And so for those of you who are interested in the academic job market down the road, there's a need to build up and demonstrate in some way your knowledge and skills and abilities as a scholar. For those of you who are not choosing the academic job market and you're in school or district context, nevertheless making progress on your research and scholarship, irrespective of whether it's an action research project or whether it's something that is more theoretical or conceptual. There's still this idea of trying to maintain a pace and a productivity. And so many doctoral students need to keep conducting and writing scholarship, but this idea of traditional access to schools and districts is still rather uncertain, especially with recent spikes in certain states. And so that leads to the question about, well, given this uncertain access, what might I do in terms of scholarship while I'm sheltering in place? And so I just wanted to present a few high-level ideas, just an overarching paradigm on data collection for potential ideas for studies, or at least avenues for studies, and then a few high-level suggestions on maintaining progress. So when it comes to data collection, I think we're familiar with two different kinds of data collection, primarily primary data and secondary data. And so what this translates to in the COVID-19 era is, from a distance, still using primary data collection methods like surveys, interviews, and focus groups. I think focus groups via Zoom or WebEx or something other like an online platform that can record video or audio is probably a little bit more difficult than being able to conduct those in person, but nonetheless, those still remain a medium with which to collect primary data. And then secondary data, there's a number of existing data sets through ICPSR, for instance, or through other state departments of education who have public information requests and respond by sending data or granting access to data. And then there's document analyses and policy analyses. And I think that these, in some respects, are underutilized. And I'll expand more on that here on the next slide. But while primary data collection is great, especially for new topics and understudied phenomena, primary data collection really does require, from my perspective, considerable planning on what I call the front end. And so designing the study itself, identifying potential participants, gaining consent from those participants, and then you're using participants' time and energy to be able to collect that data. And so while primary data collection is all well and good, I do think that there are some opportunities here to potentially take advantage of a lot of the existing data that are already out there. And so methodologically, much of my scholarship uses secondary data. And as I mentioned, there's so much information that's already out there that's unorganized, unexamined, and unanalyzed. And that's where I think this particular approach could be ideal for this notion of sheltering in place when traditional access to schools and districts, as I mentioned, remains uncertain. So I want to go through 4 ideas. I'm going to go through the first 2 with a reasonable degree of depth, and then I'll just highlight the 3rd and the 4th ideas. And so this first idea is what I call a landscape study. And I'm a big fan of landscape studies. I don't know that there's enough of them that are done. And my perspective is, before expending considerable energy on a study that you're going to use primary data collection methods for, so say interviews or surveys, one suggestion is to perhaps start with a landscape study to get a 30,000-foot perspective of your topic of interest. And this is simply using existing data and documents to, quote, map the landscape of a topic. And findings from landscape studies can undergird and inform and strengthen your future scholarship efforts. So if you have an interest in a particular topic, for instance, and I've got 2 examples here that we can talk about, rather than immediately go to or decide to collect primary data with interviews, surveys, or focus groups, I would suggest taking advantage of the litany of documents that are present on websites, that are present in repositories, in prior research, and then use those documents to get a better understanding of what the field or the topic that you're interested in looks like, and then use that as a paper, and then you can cite that paper as a way to inform your future sampling strategies. So I've got 2 research questions in terms of ideas for landscape studies. And so the first one would be, how would U.S. state education agencies or state departments of education espouse to support educational leaders to administer school improvement efforts? And so I want to highlight that verb espouse, because you're not collecting primary data, you're using prior data that's been either posted to websites without the intention of it being analyzed, or existing data sets. But nonetheless, if you read the documents and you analyze them, what do these state departments of education espouse to do when it comes to supporting leaders to administer improvement efforts? So to answer this question, I think the first thing I would do is conduct a literature review to see what's out there about state departments of education, or SCAs, depending on your terminology, and ed leadership. What are the potential intersections between those two constituent groups? And next, I would review SCA websites and professional association websites for relevant documents. So, in a couple examples for some work that I'm doing, some state departments of education don't really involve themselves much with leadership. And the professional associations for principals and assistant principals in those states take a much greater lead in developing professional development opportunities or connecting early career or novice administrators to veteran administrators. And so with this, it's taking advantage of all of these documents and articles and web pages that are posted, but that, as I mentioned prior, remain unorganized, unanalyzed, and they're just sitting there waiting for someone to take a systematic look at them. And I think one of the critiques of this kind of approach is that you can argue that websites are uneven in terms of quality. They're potentially inaccurate. They might be out of date. And I've received reviewer feedback on manuscripts that I've written that mention those same critiques. And I get that. But at some point, it doesn't all have to be primary collection. And that's one of the points that I want to try to make with landscape studies about how they can really provide some insight. And for those of you that have had a chance to read both versions of the Handbook on Research on Educational Leadership, which is authored by Michelle Young and colleagues, a couple of the critiques of the field that they point out are that there's a lot of one-off case studies. And it's great to drill deep into one context, into one set of actors, but at the same time, there's a need, I would argue, to map the landscape. So take a look at a number of different case studies and then try to see what commonalities or differences you can surmise based on zooming out, as I mentioned, to 30,000 feet. So a second research question or idea could be, how do school districts espouse to develop culturally responsive educators? So again, I would start with a review of the literature to see what's out there, especially about school districts and what they're doing in terms of culturally responsive practices, whether it's through professional development, whether it's through recruitment and retention of new teachers, whether it's through partnerships with local administrator preparation programs, about the kinds of leaders that are involved and that the districts are hiring or trying to hire. And then I would also then review these district websites. And so you can devise a sampling strategy about what kinds of districts you want to use. And so there's about 11 to 12,000 school districts in the United States, if that's where your area of focus is in the United States. And so you can choose a homogeneous approach, and you can only study urban districts, for instance, or you can choose a more heterogeneous approach. Maybe you devise a comparative scheme based on a district's median household income, for instance. And so you might have low income districts, quote unquote, middle income districts, quote unquote, and then high income districts, quote unquote. And that's how you're going to stratify your sampling there. But after you devise your sampling strategy, then I would recommend visiting the websites of these school districts and seeing what documents you can find. And then also you might consider reviewing some news sources as well. And again, all you're trying to do is just search for what, with these particular school districts, have they done with culturally responsive education, if anything. And the absence of findings to me is still a finding in and of itself. So for that last bullet point, Danny, if you wouldn't mind just reviewing the school district websites would be one of the recommendations. So a second idea, if you take a landscape study as the first, the second one is a policy analysis. And I think that these are in many ways also not done enough based on my early reads of literatures, even though I just am 5 years into this profession, 4 as a doctoral student, then 1 as an assistant professor. But as we know, governmental entities like legislatures and school boards, they produce a lot of policy. Some of the policy is mundane, but some of the policy is majorly consequential. And I think typically the individuals who study these kinds of policies tend to be outside the research community, and they might give it a cursory glance, for instance, or they might call a few people, they'll publish an article or two in newspapers or news sites, and then they'll move on to the next current event of the day. But taking a really intentional and deeper dive is something that I think a policy analysis could really help out with. And so I think similar to a landscape study, a policy analysis is also helpful, to lay a foundation for your future scholarship efforts. Because again, you're looking to try to find a way to substantiate and strengthen a sampling strategy about, well, why these 5 districts, for instance, or why these 7 states. And so rather than just kind of selecting them at random, you're getting a lay of the land from a policy perspective about where you might want to dig deeper. And so there are 2 ways you can do. You can consider going wider with a policy analysis, and so you can do a landscape study, but specifically focus on one policy, for instance, or you can go deeper and you can look through just a single entity. So, for instance, the Missouri Department of Secondary or Elementary and Secondary Education, and you might focus on just that entity, and then you might do a policy analysis related to standardized testing, for example, or the adoption of Common Core standards. And then a policy, you might examine just one policy. So in which case, like Common Core, for instance, or the Every Student Succeeds Act, that you can just choose a single policy and go deeper into the analysis with that. Next thing would be to choose a theoretical or conceptual framework that's related to your topic or your research questions. I think this is particularly apropos for policy analyses. There's a range of different frameworks that you can use and pull from, all the way, as I mentioned, from the mentors that I had at UVA, some of whom specialized in structural functionalism, and then folks who specialized only in critical work. And they viewed things through critical race theory lenses, for instance, or culturally responsive leadership practices, for example. But you're choosing some kind of theoretical or conceptual framework as you go through to identify and then analyze these policy documents. And then you would go through and use existing data and documents, as I mentioned, analyze them using that framework. So what some ideas might look like for a policy analysis. So a first thing could be, what aspects of education do local school board members describe as those within their jurisdiction? And so this gets back to this idea of espoused versus enacted. And I used the verb espouse a few slides ago, but if you're curious and interested in examining what policies, for instance, do school board members consider to be within their jurisdiction, and what do they spend the most time on, for instance, and what don't they spend the most time on? So the first thing you could do is conduct a literature review to see what's out there about local school boards and what their areas of responsibilities are and what potential actions they've taken. I think the literature on local school boards is rather thin, so that could be a great area for those of you who are interested in this particular set of actors. And then from there, you would then devise a sampling strategy similar to the prior idea about which districts you'd like to select. And then next, you'd review district websites and gather school board meeting agendas and meeting minutes. And this, again, is just a recommendation, but meeting agendas and meeting minutes are publicly available information from these different kinds of governmental actors. And so I think they represent a set of documents that have not been analyzed in the depth that they could to highlight what might be some trends. And it might be some trends that are passive or that are implicit that these actors might not know are there. And that's where your skills as a systematic scholar come into play to examine a set of documents through, a systematic process that also uses there's certain degrees of rigor with theoretical or conceptual frameworks to try to inform how you're analyzing the documents, then how you'll report your findings. Another source you might consider after these district websites would be news sources for reports about certain school board meetings or members or actions. And so let's say you're going through some meeting agendas or some minutes and you come up with some ideas about certain policies. You might turn to some state news sources or some local TV coverage, for instance, of a TV station that's in the area. And you might use those to triangulate, what the perspective has been versus what you find in the minutes and the agendas. Another idea with a policy analysis could be a sample research question of what do state legislative committees responsible for education identify as important issues, and what are their responses to those issues? And so again, like this might seem like basic descriptive work, but there really isn't much as I mentioned, in terms of landscape studies or policy analyses that help researchers decide where to dig, to try to move away from just convenient sampling to try to actually inform where you think you should dig a little bit deeper in. And so with this potential research question that you might say, all right, I'm going to conduct a literature review, similar to where you should start, about state legislative committees. And so these might be House committees on education or Senate committees on education, and then see what, how this intersects with issues and what these committees have come up with in terms of policy responses. And so then once you have kind of an understanding of what the literature is, similar to the above, you'll devise a sampling strategy. So which states do you want to examine? And then after that, review news sources for reports about committee meetings and members and actions. And you might identify a set of documents or meeting minutes from the committees themselves, but often I would say another source of documents related to this research question would be reviewing the very policies that these committees pass or repeal, and then why they do that. So that could be another idea when it comes to doing a policy analysis, and you might take a critical lens for it. So given 5 states and examining their House and Senate committees and what those committees have talked about and what they've highlighted, who's missing from the conversation, or what constituencies appear to not have benefited from the kinds of policy decisions that these committees have made, for instance, over the last 5 years. And so rather than just a purely descriptive piece, you might actually start to move into a piece that critiques. So those are 2 in-depth ideas, these landscape studies and policy analyses. And I wanted to just highlight briefly about 2 more ideas that you could do that I think don't require as much of the intense primary collection that I mentioned a few slides ago. So a third idea would be around a discourse analysis. And I admittedly haven't done much research in this area, but have a number of colleagues who have done discourse analyses, and I've read some really great work about people who have chosen this methodology. And so a discourse analysis would be a specific examination of spoken or written text. And so you have a bunch of documents, as I mentioned, from those prior ideas, but you're looking explicitly at the kind of language and words that are used by either policymakers or within the documents themselves. And so where this comes to next is you'll choose a theoretical or conceptual framework similar to the policy analysis, and you'll use this to root your data analyses. So what particular lenses are you going to use? And then finally, you'll review, say, speeches or press releases or statements, news stories, policymaker websites. And so, let's say, for instance, for those 5 states that you examined for the policy analysis, you actually take a look at press releases of all of the members of the House and Senate Education Committee members. So let's say that there's 10 members on each of those committees, and so that's 20 members per state. And so you might say, all right, well, what press releases have these members put out over the last couple of years? And I'm going to examine these press releases to see how they frame the same issue. So does it differ by political party, for instance? Does it differ by region of the state? Does it differ if somebody's elected at an at-large position and they represent a larger geographic area versus somebody who was elected by district or by ward and they have a much smaller geographic area? And so there are certain ways that you can slice it, but you're specifically examining the spoken or written text that are within these documents. And so one example that comes to mind, John Almeida at Harvard, I took a look at state governor state of the state addresses over a 20-year time period from the mid-80s to the early 2000s. And that was the only data source for one of these studies. Is he accessed and downloaded and analyzed and coded the state of the state addresses for each governor over a 20-year time period. So it's a massive data set, and then identified the extent to which and what kinds of profiles governors tended to be. So were they quote unquote education governors or were they not? And I would suggest finding that work if you want a really good example. And then a fourth idea, very briefly, is an emerging methodology that some colleagues have introduced me to that I haven't had a chance to dig into with my own work, and that's quant crit. So taking a critical approach to typically quantitative data. And so Garcia and colleagues with that citation right there, to my knowledge and from what I can find, is one of the early articles to talk about quant crit. And so I think one of the notions of qualitative data is that it's a social construction. So these are people's perspectives. But there's also a social construction of quantitative data. So the kinds of survey questions that you would ask and then how you report it, where you sample. And so that's one of the arguments that Garcia and colleagues make, is that this is also something that should be applied to quantitative data. And so next, one of the goals of quant crit is to challenge the implicit or explicit assumptions that are found within quantitative data. And so what the typical lens that you would use, at least in the early work on quant crit, is critical race theory, or CRT, as a lens to guide your data collection and analyses. And so how that plays out is identifying existing secondary data sets, whether you have access to the survey instruments that were used to collect the data for those data sets, or if you have a chance to devise and administer your own survey. And so I know that moves us into the primary collection piece, but I think as you have a chance, for those of you who have interest in this area, as you read up on Quant Crit, because of its newness as a methodological paradigm, I think this is probably one area that primary collection could really be beneficial, and that would be a recommendation there to devise and administer a survey. But it doesn't have to be just documents, and it doesn't have to be just policy analyses or landscape studies. There's a way to, I think, do the shelter in place aspect using quantitative data as well. And that's one recommendation, is this Quant Crit piece. So just to close out and then turn it back over to Danny, some high level tips on making progress. And so I think one aspect that's beneficial is to work with a small team of colleagues within or across institutions. And Holly and Danny and I were talking before the webinar started about reaching out to some folks that you would like to form research partnerships with, and maybe some folks that you haven't had a chance to catch up with. You see them at a conference, for instance, or you trade emails with them, or you see them on Twitter, and you've promised to follow up. Maybe this is a chance to actually reach out to them. And this is especially important, I think, if you do landscape studies. So, if you want to do multiple US states, for instance, or if you're in another country, for example, and there's multiple provinces or sub-administrative districts, and it would help to, meet as a team, and then you can break up data collection among the group of you. And I think in terms of actually maintaining progress, two quick suggestions. One would be just to meet weekly about the project, even if it's just a 15-minute check-in, it still is a way to maintain some consistency. But then on the other hand, I would also schedule some synchronous Zoom work sessions. And these could be team work sessions to maintain progress. You all could be on Zoom, for instance, or another video platform service. And you might, do your check-in, but then you work collectively, but with your cameras off for 45 minutes, and it's a structured work session. And so this could be a way to maintain progress and promote accountability. And then our last recommendation is to set specific data collection, analysis, and writing goals. And this is an area that I'm still very much working on to be more specific, but a suggestion, at least from my mentors, has always been to avoid writing more general goals like write literature review, and be much more specific with your either weekly goals or your bi-weekly goals, and say, identify, read, and synthesize 6 sources. And you're going to hold yourself to some more specificity. So those are just some high-level suggestions. This is a team effort, I would argue, and the landscape and the policy analysis pieces are definitely big behemoths when it comes to data collection analysis. And so I think the more help that you can get for these efforts, the better. So I'll stop there with those 4 ideas and turn it back over to Danny.
Oh, thank you, Brian. That was incredible. I really appreciate it. I will definitely be pursuing some of these ideas myself this summer. So why me? Dr. Mackey asked me to co-host this webinar today, and my initial reaction was, is she crazy? Why would she want me to do this? What can I possibly provide? And I felt extremely unproductive this summer. But then I thought, what? Actually, it might be a good perspective for the webinar, and have graduate students that perhaps feel unproductive as well to hear from someone who it feels the same way and can understand what the struggle's been like for the last few months, right? So who am I? I am a third-year PhD student at the University of Virginia. I am also the graduate student coordinator with Jackson Scholars Network, and I've been doing that for the last couple of years, which means that Dr. Mackey has had my assistance in creating these webinars and having this webinar series for the last couple of years. I used to be an elementary school teacher before enrolling in this program at UVA. My research interests are focused around the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion competencies of aspiring school leaders. And my current research is a mixed method study taking a deep look at how programs emphasize and approach these sort of competencies and what the needs are for the programs. And my research partners and I conducted a national survey principal preparation programs to get some data on some of these questions. So like I said, I've struggled with productivity over the last few months, And there are some things that help me be productive and stay on task, and there's some things that have been obstacles, and I'm going to share some of that with you. Before I do, please let me remind you that we will have a Q&A for myself, Dr. Van Groningen, and Dr. Mackey. If you have questions, you want to use the question box that's in the control panel or your dashboard. You click on the box and you provide any question, and we will definitely get an answer for you, okay? So as soon as you think of it, go ahead and write it in that box. So what works for me? I have found that deadlines are great. I can be very productive if I know I have a hard and fast deadline, and I tend to get things done and meet those deadlines. So that is one way to break the distraction and the procrastination. Accountability, working with colleagues, working with friends, setting goals, and working together online, on Zoom has been very effective as well. I like the idea of having somebody that will keep me, on task. When I set small blocks of time, that's also been effective, whether it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour to get something done from my list. That seems to work. Organization and lists. So first thing I do in the morning is, when I have my cup of coffee, I go to my desk, I sit down, take out the notebook, and I start making a list of what I want to accomplish that day. And as long as I have a list, I have a little box to check. That kind of keeps me on a decent sort of schedule to get things done. I have something to share regarding organization, something that I found on Twitter a couple months ago, and it has been very helpful, but I'll show you that in a minute. And again, coffee and music. If I have a cup of coffee at my desk, I can stay engaged. If I have music in the background, it kind of helps with the distraction. And then the obstacles. So I'm 44 years old, and I swear I have like adult onset ADD, because I have never struggled so hard to stay on task and to focus on one thing. But it seems like the last 3 to 6 months or so, this is becoming an issue for me. So productive procrastination, this is something that only recently I've started to really kind of dig into. And while I first think of it as a negative or an obstacle, I'm starting to see that it's actually a positive. More on that soon. But productive procrastination means, okay, I know that right now I should be writing blank, but I really can't focus on that. So instead, you know what? Let me go over to this tutorial or webinar that I find interesting. Let me watch this for an hour. I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing at the moment, but I am doing something productive. So that's called productive procrastination. I think I might have, termed this, but feel free to use it. I don't care. Anxiety, feeling overwhelmed. There have definitely been times where I feel that perhaps I can't, accomplish what I aim to accomplish at a quality that I can be proud of. I've had anxiety about, looming deadlines or projects that are coming kind of to conclusion. And so that's been one of the things that I've had to deal with and kind of overcome. But again, one of the ways that I've overcome the anxiety and feeling overwhelmed and feeling like I'm incapable of completing the task is by having a deadline. As soon as that deadline arrives, I kind of can get back into it and get it done. So earlier I mentioned that I found a resource on Twitter, and I want to thank Assistant Professor at University of Arizona, Dr. DeMarcus A. Jenkins. He provided this resource, and he wrote about how this keeps him organized and how he's able to deal with having tons of literature to read and to get through. So he uses this matrix for sort of like his first pass. And I thought it was brilliant. And I know that everybody has something similar to this. I really like this one. I started using it myself, and it has helped me kind of get through a lot of those, PDFs that I collect and, run out of time, that I have to read. So you can see the columns here are key concept, APA citation, main idea, argument, objective, columns for notes, and then quotes and page numbers. So very easy. Once you start writing something up, you can go back here, you have your quotes, you have your page numbers, etc. Okay. Survey results. So I thought for this webinar, it would be great to kind of check in with our graduate student community at UCEA. So when I advertised the webinar, I also advertised this survey, and it was a short survey, but it asked about what grad students are doing and what they're feeling while at home in regards to, you know, productivity and self-care. And we did get enough responses that I'm able to provide a little bit of data here. They were evenly split, like 1/3 each, where students are in the middle of their programs, some of them are at the end, and some of them are finished or finishing already. When asked, do you plan on being productive this summer, 50% said yes, that they plan to read and write, while 33% said writing only and 17% said reading only. No one responded, no, I don't plan on being productive this summer. So good for us, right? For grad students. 67% said that self-care is important, and some of them do it every day, and some of them do it as often as they can. 17% said, you know, the work comes first. If I have time for self-care, fine, but the work comes first. And 17% said, who has time? Are you kidding me? And so top self-care go-tos, grad students like to spend time alone. They like to watch TV or a movie. They like to read for fun. They like to spend time with family. It's funny because for me, that's something I wouldn't do for self-care, but you know, we're all different. Listening to music and exercise. When asked what your least favorite activity, working for a cause, cleaning the house, playing with a pet, or participating in a sport were the least popular. I have some more results. I asked if you felt guilty when you feel that you're less productive than you hoped, and 2/3 of the respondents said yes, they do feel guilty. I would add that I definitely feel guilty as well, but I don't think we should, and I will talk more about that later. Obstacles to being productive. Sometimes it's that inner critic, it's the uncertainty, and asking, you know, does this really matter, especially as, you know, the world that we're living in today is a little bit, you know, strange. So people are actually questioning whether, you know, reading and writing and being productive actually matters. Procrastination, distractions, you know, worrying about perfectionism is an obstacle. Convergence of all identities onto the home space. So, you know, being a mom or a dad, but also being a scholar and being a teacher and being a student, and all these things are now, you know, happening at the same time. They're converging into the home space. So that's something that took some adjusting to. Kids, of course, chaos, noise, and, you know, lack of coffee shops or having a quiet place that you could go, just like a little sanctuary to get some work done. Tricks for staying on task: timers for work and timers for breaks. Starting early in the day, getting natural light and playing some lo-fi music. Blocking off time and locking yourself in an office. The Pomodoro timer alone or with colleagues on Zoom. This is similar to what Dr. Van Groningen was talking about. And then for fun and to disconnect from work, puzzles, Netflix, cooking, and reading again. After the pandemic, what would you like to keep? Like, what have you been doing that you would like to keep in, you know, whatever the world looks like after a pandemic? So long walks, online meetings, a writing schedule, reading more, virtual sessions with friends and family, being home more, and taking breaks to be with your family. Okay, and then the last one, I think it was a really meaningful one for me, right? And this one was about valuing life, time, friendships, and family more than before, putting things in perspective, realizing what's important, right? And this respondent also said that with this new sort of perspective on life, that he is more willing to take risks even with his research. Okay, and so I have a little bit more to share, but I'm going to save it for my final thoughts, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Mackey if she's still with us. I would love to hear. I think we would all like to hear her experiences and maybe some advice that she might have for us in regards to productivity and self-care. Dr. Mackey, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. And you guys have done a wonderful job. I'm so pleased with this, and particularly the focus that you've taken with it. I think, you know, Dr. Van Groningen brings up some really good points, right? And some opportunities for research. But I think that kind of underlying that is this opportunity to get creative or to stretch yourself in ways that you hadn't thought of before. And I appreciated the fact that, through the examples, understanding how difficult it might be to engage in work that you're not used to doing can be problematic. But at the same time, it allows you to focus on work or focus on some type of project that helps you grow as a scholar. And I think the examples were phenomenal. And we do know that policy analyses and I like talking about the state of the state addresses where people aren't doing those, and while they can be dated, I think they inform us in terms of trajectories. So we're hearing a lot right now about like the arc of history, and so to think about that arc in context of what it means to prepare educational leaders, right? We have to understand the trajectory of the arc and the components embedded in it to understand where we're at today. And I think we lose that a lot in our programs where we all kind of agree that we know the history of education, but in many ways, without those types of studies, we don't have a full picture. So I certainly appreciate that. And then, speaking to Danny's comments, the one that really stuck out to me is guilt. And I was very lucky. I was mentored by Paul Begley at Penn State. He was my advisor, and he would always say, "Perfection is the enemy of done," right? And sometimes this focus on getting something perfect when people who've been doing this for 20 years will tell you they still get revised and resubmits, right? None of us are perfect. But then coupling that with this anxiety or this guilt about not being productive can be pretty devastating. And we're all experiencing the pandemic differently. And I had shared with Dr. Van Groningen and Danny that we have scholars who have nearly lost their lives just within the last couple of weeks to this, and we're a small family. Ed Leadership is a small family, and while we were doing this webinar, I just received an email from another scholar where he and his wife and his entire family have now tested positive in the last couple of days. And so I think that trying to take apart where that guilt comes from, right? And really think about, maybe the guilt isn't that you should be more productive. Maybe the guilt should be assigned to you that you could redirect, right? And take some of Dr. Van Groningen's ideas for research so you can feel as if you're accomplishing something without trying to continue on the same trajectory that you were prior to the pandemic. Or thinking about that guilt might be a way for you to actually be signaling to yourself that you need to step back, right, and take some time for yourself. And I really like the what was the productive procrastination, right? So coupling this productive procrastination where you can accomplish something and explore some of the ideas that Dr. Van Groningen presented would be, for me, something that I would do, and it's valuable there. And I don't want to take too much time because I know we have some closing thoughts, but I really appreciate both the psychological and very practical ways that the two of you have presented this topic and shared your experiences in a way that people who are perhaps feeling the same things, right, or trying to figure out ways to be productive when they can't go out and do in-person focus groups or engage in in-person interviews might approach their work.
Thank you, Dr. Mackey. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A, and these questions are for both of you. Feel free to jump in. And since you mentioned that some of our friends and colleagues have to deal with loss during this pandemic, can you talk about how someone should be able to overcome that type of pain? As they kind of work through their graduate program, do we have any advice or experience with how someone could deal with grief at a time like this?
I mean, I can start, but I'm more curious to hear, how you two are thinking about it, because in my position, I tend to be exposed to more, right, when people are seeking help, right, or assistance or guidance in some way. And so I would say that would be my advice to you is, if you are struggling.
I will jump in and share that, I haven't had personal experience with loss in a long time. But, I do struggle with worrying about my family. For example, they live in Florida. Florida is one of the hot spots right now. And, my mom has her health issues. My sister, her lungs have been compromised from,
Flounder. Pardon me?
yeah, my sister's lungs were compromised a few years back from dealing with pneumonia. So I've been really worried about their health and making sure that they kind of follow protocols and things like that. And you know what? They don't follow protocols. They don't really listen to my advice. So I've had to kind of deal with, they're adults and they're going to do what they're going to do, and I have to kind of prepare myself for whatever happens. And recently, some family members have tested positive. We've been very fortunate that their symptoms have been mild for the most part, and I hope that they stay that way. But yeah, it's a constant worry, and the only thing I can do really is control my own behavior and worry about my own health.
Mhm.
I think on my end, and just briefly, so Danny, you mentioned, I guess the word should get over it. And, I wrestle with that. One of my best friends passed away from pulmonary embolism 6 years ago, and he was 29. And it was a watershed moment, admittedly, in my life to really stop and take stock of what I think is important and what I choose to spend my time with, or who I choose to spend my time with and spend it on. And I think, in terms of contending with considerable grief, I think it's a matter of checking in on others and maintaining relationships. And even if it's just a drop in, a text every so often, for instance, of, hey, thinking about you. I think that's a way to really keep the bonds between folks really strong, especially as lives become more harried. But I'd argue that it's, rarely, I think, will you overcome it, quote unquote, especially if it's a member of your family, for instance, who you're very close with, or it's a very close friend, like it was for me, for example. But I think, they provide poignant moments to stop and reflect on what you choose to spend your time on and where. And I have folks, I think, that hold me accountable more so than they did in the past about trying to hold true to that. And I'd argue that despite the immense loss and tragedy of losing him, that's been a really incredible consequence on my life and how I choose to structure how I spend it.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you for that. And I do think back to possibly the biggest loss that I ever had was when I lost my dad many years ago. But there was a lot of guilt after that loss, feeling like I didn't do enough as a son and building a relationship with him. So something that I did try to practice for a while was, understanding that tomorrow is not guaranteed. So making an effort to, maintain that communication, like you said, checking in and keeping, those relationships strong. And, I guess for myself personally, maybe it's all human beings, that's a struggle. It's so easy to forget that, but I will definitely work on it. Thank you. I think we can move on to the next question. How do you suggest communicating with faculty if we're struggling with our obligations due to being overwhelmed?
I'm happy to start for that one. I think another consequence, frankly, of my friend's passing that I just mentioned is that I've become less focused on mincing words and just being, much more overt and honest with how things are and where they stand. And I certainly understand that there are power dynamics in doctoral programs that are inescapable. And it's easy for me to just proffer advice, you know, now being on the other side of degree completion, but that'd be my key piece, is just to be forthcoming. And, you know, all details, for instance, don't need to be revealed, but it's, you know, everybody's trying to make it, and they're trying to make it in ways that are suitable for their circumstances and that they feel comfortable with in terms of what, you know, what they feel like they should be able to do and what they can do. And I think it's a matter of mutual respect with one another. And unfortunately, you know, there are stories out there where that mutual respect isn't present, particularly between advisors or other faculty members and graduate students. And, you know, those are certainly stories that that give me pause and sort of these "you got to be kidding me" moments. But I would just recommend being very candid and honest.
Yeah, you know, I think that's excellent advice, and I would also caution people from trying to take apart, right, the messages they receive back. So if you've communicated with somebody and you know you feel that the message might be short or they might not be extending the compassion that you would have thought. um, I know when I have gotten some messages recently, it was more important for me to acknowledge very quickly and get something out, right? And then, you know, I can follow up with something longer later. But I think the anxiety that comes with reaching out in the first place can also cause us to perhaps misinterpret the response on the part of our faculty or our mentors with whom we're communicating. And just assuming that they are supportive and have your best interest is a much better route to take than assuming that they somehow don't care or they're short, or reading into a shorter message that they might be angry with you for some reason.
We are running out of time, but I do want to squeeze in two more questions. The first one is in regards to the suggestions we gave today on the webinar. Do I need to go through the IRB process for this type of work?
That's a great question. And so if you're collecting primary data, I would say that yes, you're certainly in IRB, right? Or you're in the IRB arena. One thing that I've asked both IRB boards for, so when I was at University of Virginia and now University of Delaware, is if I'm searching for publicly available documents that would be on a website that either aren't visible on a web page or that they've been moved or they've been archived, and if I email a State Department of Education official, for instance, to ask about the location of those documents, that I've been told from two institutions is not IRB, because those are publicly available documents. So I would check with your local board just to make sure, because those institutional policies differ. But if you're not collecting original data from folks and you're simply trying to aggregate information that's already available, from my experience for those policy analyses and those landscape studies, if you're using just documents and meeting minutes, for instance, or meeting agendas, you don't have to go through IRB, which is also another advantage for the sheltering in place aspect, because it lets you start the project and move through data collection without having to wait for IRB approval.
Dr. Mackey, do you need to add anything to that?
No, I thought that was a fantastic answer.
Perfect. So the last question.
Sorry, Danny, great point though to be concerned about IRB, because protecting participant time and energy, I think, is essential in this particular period that we're going through. So the educators, I think, who are most likely to be asked of their time, I'd argue that there's even an increased duty and ethic on behalf of us as scholars collecting data to be ultra respectful of their time.
Okay, so last question, and I have to ask it while we have you. Any advice for participating in the job market this fall?
Dr. Mackey, would you like to start?
Yeah. Oh, well, it's a tough market, and it's going to be a tough market for a while as things recover. So the advice I have for people who have asked me as of late is to not focus so much on the job market, but to first of all explore, you know, postdoc opportunities, right, things like that. But speaking right back into Dr. Van Groningen's suggestions, right, it's an opportunity, knowing that jobs will be quite limited, particularly if you are not willing to move, right, that far from where you're at, to really beef up your vita, right? Focus on getting publications, focus on professional development. And it's, I was going to talk about this in a minute, but, we have some webinars coming up where we're looking at some of the more hard skills, right? Thinking about methodology and how can you expand your methodological repertoire? How can you engage in work that really showcases what your research trajectory might look like for you? So you're building a better case, and the job market will, of course, open, especially in these places that they might have put a freeze in, right? I suspect that we'll have a decent recovery and places will start to open up, but it's an opportunity to make yourself the best candidate you can possibly be and position yourself to get the interviews that you would like to have in this time where we don't know what's going to be happening.
Yeah, I'll just support the comment in particular about using this as a time to beef up. And for whatever the market's going to be, I'll just name it. It's super tough, as Dr. Mackey mentioned, but this is a chance to dig into the primary skills based on the types of organizations that you'd like to work for when you finish your degree. So if you're a district level administrator, for instance, and you're looking for a senior district position, taking a look at what kind of skills and then how that can translate into your scholarship time, for instance, while you're in your program, or if you're interested in an academic position or a postdoctoral position, that using this to demonstrate those knowledge, skills, and abilities is essential. But I'll just be frank, as Dr. Mackey was, that it's going to be an uncertain year, and I wish I could offer a rosier portrait.
Thank you. I think that takes us to final thoughts. I'll go ahead and jump in and share mine real quick. So when my initial reaction was, I have not been productive. I can't be, the graduate student voice for this webinar, but in preparation, I had to kind of take stock or conduct sort of like an internal audit, and then I realized, like, wait a minute, in the last few months, I've finished a paper with my research team and we submitted it for publication. We also kept our research going. We keep working on that. There's a grant that I was able to a small grant that I completed. I keep working, I work at UCA and headquarters is transitioning. I adopted a cat and somehow I've been able to keep myself and the cat alive for the last few months. So, we shouldn't feel guilty because we're being very productive, right? Even if we think we're not. So just keep that in mind. And as you start venturing out and you start, finding things to use to take care of yourself over the summer, be safe, wear your mask. Okay. Thank you.
Happy to go next. I think in terms of final thoughts, this is an unprecedented time. And I know there's countless messages and statements that are coming from companies, for instance, institutions that you work for or organizations that you volunteer for about the unprecedented nature of what's going on. And so I think folks who are searching for answers, that I'm in that same category of trying to make some sense of it, but I think that it's going to be quite uncertain for some time, and trying to maintain a center with reaching out to family, for instance, or to your social networks, or meditation, for example, or yoga or exercise. I think that'd be my one piece, is to find some ways to connect with individuals who make you feel whole, or with practices or experiences that help make you feel whole.
Dr. Mackey?
I don't have any final thoughts. I think you've all captured it well, and this particular network hears my thoughts often. So
okay.
I did want to say, in terms of research, well, first of all, now that Dr. Van Groningen has done a webinar with us, he's now put into the pool of faculty that we are happy to connect you with, right? Should you want to learn more or have a conversation with him. So you can go ahead and get a hold of Danny if you want to do that, or you can email Dr. Van Groningen directly. But we're happy to connect folks up who need to do that. And then, just building off of Dr. Van Groningen's examples, we are putting together a Jackson Scholar collective research project, right, that has a lot of different parts. and we've been kind of holding off sending the survey out until we had all of the third-year scholar meetings done. But it is an opportunity for you to start thinking about the ideas that Dr. Van Groningen had in relation to ways that we can conduct research that is meaningful to us as members of Jackson Scholars Network, and of course we would open that up to people from graduate student council and graduate students at other schools as well. So that will be coming through soon. So not only do we want to give you some ideas, but we've also developed a way to operationalize some of the suggestions that were put into this webinar today.
Actually, and then one quick comment too. I'm happy to to talk with anybody who listens to the webinar, for instance, today, or when it's recorded. Please feel free to reach out. Giving back and helping is incredibly important to me, and just all you have to do is send an email, and please don't feel like even the most minute of question would be something that you don't want to send a note about. So connect with Danny or with Dr. Mackey, and happy to help out however I can.
So in closing, I want to say, first of all, thank you for hanging in there. We ran over a little bit, but we were just having a great chat, and that happens. My email address is up there. As the graduate student coordinator and assistant for UCA and Jackson Scholars Network, I've collected a lot of resources. So if you need something, if you have a question, feel free to reach out. If I don't have it or know the answer, I could recommend someone that might. So we are there for you. And I do have a couple quick announcements. Scholar nominations and mentor nominations for the new Jackson Scholars Network cohort is open. That portal is open, and they're due June 30th. If you know someone that might be interested, let them know. We will have future webinars. We don't have any information on the topics just yet, but we have been talking about having something around methods, maybe around a literature review. So that information is coming. And if you want to know what's happening within the network, follow us on Twitter at UCEAJSN. And then with that, I will let Dr. Mackey say goodbye.
Or the dog did. Yes, thank you all so much. And thank you, Dr. Van Groningen. Thank you, Danny. This was a fantastic webinar, and we look forward to seeing everybody at our next webinar.
Have a good one.